Welcome, James. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you very, very much for having me. I'm very excited to have this conversation with you guys. It should be fun.
It's always fun. Yeah, thank you. James' projects include Tusk, Camp X-Ray, Medicine for Melancholy, Moonlight, If Beale Street Could Talk, and the upcoming series Underground Railroad, which I can't wait to see. It's always fun. Yeah, thank you. So I'd love to kind of hear your background a little bit. Where did, you came from San Francisco, but you went to college in Florida, and, what inspired you and what drove you across the country?
Yeah, it's a very strange idea to kind of, I think for most people who have some cursory idea about where, film schools are, Florida, Northern Florida and Tallahassee might not reach top of mind. Traditionally anyway, but what I really loved going there, to be perfectly honest, and had a great time. And, as I'm sure we'll talk about, met some great people that I still work with today. But yeah, you're right. Leaving California was an interesting choice, but I'm very happy that I made it. But yeah, my interest in filmmaking, going back a little further, it's fair to say it probably started with my mother, who is a costume designer. And so, as any child of someone in the industry, you tend to visit the set quite a lot, and your spring breaks and Christmas breaks and things like that are spent going to visit a parent and, walking around the film set and just sort of, as a child, taking it all in. So that was my first sort of wide-eyed, perspective of it, which was fantastic. And I think the first thing kids generally, I did anyway, but I see most kids sort of take in is the chaos of it all, the wild energy that exists on a film set, the different departments all running around, people are carrying crazy equipment and sets and flats and lights and cameras and props and all these different things. And as a kid, for me, that was just kind of looked like a lot of fun, to be perfectly honest. And so that was my first engagement in it, which was sort of falling for the kind of just the energy and the visceral feeling of the collaborative process. For me, that was sort of what really engaged quickly was that. And this is sort of ages 10 through 16. So then I went to high school, went to an arts focused high school where I studied, film. And the first day you're there at, I guess, whatever age that is, at 14 or whatever it might be, handed, a Bolex with 16 mil film in it. Wow. Super 8 cameras, weird, old video stuff. And I just sort of spent 4 years not getting a very good education, but 4 years having a lot of fun with some equipment, basically. So I know I don't spell very well. I don't know mathematics very well, but I can do pretty good on the camera.
Very nice. So you always wanted to run away with the circus. I got it. Yeah.
I think that's the fair way of putting it. I think you're right. I sort of did. I felt before it was story, before it was filmmaking, it was just the collaborative process. And I think still today, that's still my first love of what I do now. Director relationships for me, for example, are incredibly key because that's the kind of focal point of the collaborative process. But that could also be said true, of course, for gaffers, production designers, first ADs, producers. Everybody. That's my first love is the people involved, and that probably comes before everything else involved in filmmaking. But that people connection means quite a lot to me.
Very nice.
Yeah. But then in film school and that was lovely. It was hot. I remember that. Coming from California to go to Northern Florida was different.
Different humidity.
Different kind of heat. Yeah. It was tough. Took me a bit, but I loved it, obviously, and I had nothing but positive memories of that experience. Really, as crazy as it was. Of course, it was crazy and hard and all the different things. But looking back with rosy glasses, anyway, I had a great time in Northern Florida for sure. And then graduated in 2003 from there. And that was an interesting time in filmmaking in this country, because what was happening was there was this real sort of sort of energy about independent films. Particularly a lot of film festivals were engaged in finding young voices, sort of cameras like HVX 200s and XL2s and 1s and things like that were kind of coming out, putting youngish, filmmakers, giving them cameras and telling stories in very kind of I guess you might call it documentary style. People talk about it as like mumblecore and things like that. And that was sort of the bubble that I was sort of in early on, coming out of school. I don't necessarily consider Medicine for Melancholy a mumblecore film, but some people do. But it was definitely like, I guess, you know, in that wheelhouse and amongst that kind of filmmaking groups, you could, you know, call them, and sort of ran from there. I mean, it just was an opportunity that film particularly gave, you know, Barry and I and everyone involved, you know, a good sort of big foot in the door, because it, you know, got to play at strong film festivals. We were very lucky to play at like Toronto and London and South by Southwest and a lot of others. And it just exposed us to the industry in a way that thought, okay, well, let's just keep pushing. Took a while, but Moonlight came next a few years later. And then, you know, and so on and so on. Yeah.
Very nice.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I always like to ask about, you know, the inspirations. What were the films you were watching, or other filmmakers you were really attracted to, and things that really kind of sparked your energy and really stick to you and rewatch?
Yeah. I mean, that, you know, those early days, it was obviously the classics of that. I'm sure are on everyone's list, the Kubricks, you know, Altman, but then got more sort of specific later on in loving films like Wong Kar-wai's films. Obviously, I remember seeing those in the theater when I was still, I don't know how old I was, but when I saw In the Mood for Love in the theater. But that was my first film of his I saw, and then I went back and watched Chungking Express and Happy Together and a bunch, and, you know, Days of Being Wild and the rest. So he was a first love for sure. I remember watching Lynn Ramsey's Ratcatcher early on and thinking, oh, that's such a beautiful voice, and you know, and thinking like, oh, okay, there's some people out there in the world that are seeing story through, you know, a lens that I find exciting and inspiring, and, you know, well, maybe I should give it a shot, basically. So that was sort of, it's a long list that's hard to sort of like capsulate, you know, specifically, but, you know, Lynn Ramsey, of course, Wong Kar-wai, you know, Claire Denis, of course, Ho Xiaoxin, but, you know, American filmmakers as well, like David Gordon Green. I mean, he was huge for us in those early, you know, so that early 2000s, maybe even late 90s. I can't remember George Washington's release date, but it was sort of in that world.
There.
And that sort of was big for us as well in Tallahassee. You know, I know David was from, or not from, but had studied North Carolina, just up the road a little bit from us. And I think we definitely saw his films and thought we could give it a shot and see what happened, basically. I think he was quite inspiring, because, you know, working again outside of the traditional studio system at the time anyway. And that was sort of our sentiments as well. What we wanted to try and do to get our foot in the door, so to speak.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah.
Any mentors during that time for you guys?
I mean, there's lots. I mean, I don't know that I ever had an official mentor. I you know, like Checo Barese, I remember working with him on a film as a camera trainee for a while, and that was wonderful. And he was very kind and supportive. I remember, you know, I don't know that Checo at the time could drive, or at least he said he couldn't drive. So I just drove him everywhere, basically. I'm not sure if that was, you know, if that was really actually true that he couldn't or not. But nevertheless, I would pick him up in the morning to go to set and drive him home, and had wonderful conversations that I still remember to this day, about filmmaking and being a cinematographer and things like that. But I don't know that I ever had like a real mentor in the way that I guess I assume you're alluding to a little bit. I wish I did, but it wasn't. You know, I think now we're seeing quite a lot of that happening now, I think, which is fantastic. You know, early 2000s, I don't remember those opportunities to like be a mentee really being discussed, to be perfectly honest. I think the process at that time, and I'm sure it was true earlier, was, you know, if you want to get into it, you assist, you know, you work up the ranks and yada yada yada, and that has very much changed, obviously, in the last, you know, decade and a half, or, you know, 20 years or so. I think the process to become a cinematographer is very, very different, or can be different anyway. You can still do the traditional route, of course, and power to you, but I definitely see a lot more young people just, you know, getting out there and hustling, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. That's been an interesting topic we've been discussing on the
Yeah.
last episodes, is
Mm.
how that we've seen a transition. We've seen, it used to be back in the day that you really had to
Yeah.
work your way up the ranks, and
Yeah.
start as a loader, camera PA, and,
Yeah. Which I did, by the
assistant.
way. I mean, I was in 600 as a loader for a very long time, and it worked, basically loaded film and second AC for a number of years, sort of between Medicine for Melancholy and Moonlight, and even before Medicine for Melancholy, I was loading film on films and commercials in general in the Bay Area up in Northern California, before I moved to LA just after Medicine for Melancholy came out. So I kind of did a hybrid. That was sort of my journey, as I was sort of, assisting for a number of years, but also on the, whether it's a weekend small shoot or whether it was like take a month off to do a small feature, I did both tracks basically.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. Like,
So one of the, go ahead. Yep.
I was gonna say, it's like betting on roulette, both black and, red. It's like, I just did both. Hedge my bets basically. Yeah.
Nice. So speaking of just kind of transitioning over into now you shooting, one of the things we talked about on Friday was, most of what you shot has been digital. And, speaking about that experience and, choosing to shoot digital or choosing to shoot film, and why you make those choices.
Did it. Yeah. Yeah. No, well, so we graduated film school at a very interesting time. 2003 was, in that sort of early 2000s period, was this sort of, I would call it almost a transitional period. The digital cinema stuff wasn't really competing necessarily quite yet with, traditional 35 mil films at that point. We're still talking about cameras that are, 1/3 chip or 2/3 chip sensors that, by no means had the look and feel of what, like, an Alexa or an LF or whatever it might be these days. So I had gone to film school shooting 16 mostly, and then graduated and then had to sort of learn the digital stuff, because I was, like I said, assisting and loading film on shows that were shooting 35 and 16 and whatnot. But no one was going to give, understandably so, a 23-year-old kid a lot of film, or the money to process it, or any of the above. And so we shifted our approach to digital filmmaking. It just seemed like, and we had access to those things as opposed to access to the film stuff. It was financial, to be perfectly honest. I mean, we were making films that just couldn't afford to do film, period. Whatever Kodak grant you want to give us, we don't have the money to process it. We don't have any of those things, or the prints, or anything like remotely like that at all. So it wasn't in our world at all. So we just sort of learned the digital stuff. This is like 2003 through 2008 or 9, because that's what we had access to, period, which is fine. I don't remember feeling all that frustrated, to be perfectly honest, in that medium, even though I clearly realized it was, somewhat, I don't know, inferior at the time anyway. Now it's a very different kind of conversation, but for then it just felt like this is what I had access to. And it was just, it came down to money, really. The early on days stuff anyway. That's sort of where that came from. But it was great because it sort of maybe it retrained us, it re-engaged our brains into a different format, so to speak, which I think so we had the background of learning film, exposing film, all the different things that go along with that, learning about the print process, seeing, all the different stuff. But then applying that to digital approach as well. So like when we were making films early on digital, we were still using the same techniques and of lighting, of whatnot that I was doing on film as well anyway. So it didn't really, I don't remember ever being frustrated or put off by it. I just remember feeling like this is what we have access to. Let's try this. That's sort of how I think about it anyway.
Have you felt any pressure from some of the filmmakers you've been working with to potentially shoot film again?
Pressure is an interesting word. No, first of all, I'm very open to shooting film. I by no means have any ill feelings about it. I would love to have the opportunity to try that go down that road again. The last thing I did in film was at least a year and a half ago at this point, if not 2 years ago. It was lovely, but it was a small music video that I had a great time on. But it just isn't, it isn't it isn't the format of most of the people that I collaborate with at this point, you know, but that's not a bad, you know, that's just what it is. I definitely feel like I've yet to shoot film stock on a movie or anything yet where the budget was such where I felt like I could still approach it the same way I would digitally. And what I mean by that is, like, you know, a lot of directors I work with still love rolling on and on and on and trying to find things and just keep it going, and the momentum and all the different things. I've yet to sort of, you know, find myself in a position where a production could afford that kind of approach and just roll film in that sort of way, you know. It isn't what I've, you know, but that also has everything to do with the directors I've worked with that lack a certain kind of process. You know, some directors love the film process for many great reasons. So it's just like anything, a tool that you know, that works for you for one reason or another. But I definitely don't, by no means, I don't have any feeling about one is better or whatever than any other one personally. Yeah.
So before we get into talking specifically about projects and also talking about format, which is what I was hoping we'd spend some good time with today. You know, you brought up a really interesting perspective that you bring to the set. And that's the perspective of almost assuming what the audience is going to be starting to look for. You know, you spoke about how you feel the audience today is much more educated in the ways of cinema and maybe tools and so on and so forth. And they have certain expectations on how the film is going to look, and they're paying more attention to that. And so I'm interested to hear, you know, how you bring that, how you translate that, you know, you work with your directors and other filmmakers.
Yeah. I mean, my argument basically is some version of, you know, we just consume so many images at this point. We as you know, audiences in general can just consume so much visual information constantly at this point, whether you're on a social media thing like Instagram, or whether you're, you know, watching streaming content constantly at home. Whatever you're doing, I just think we're just inundated at this point in our lives with visual imagery constantly. And I think at this point, we've all gotten pretty savvy about it. Not just cinematographers, not just filmmakers, but just public at large at this point are relatively savvy about how images are created, how light functions, and, you know, and the way in which you can utilize these techniques to tell a story or to have some effect visually. So I believe that audiences kind of come to the theater with that expectation constantly and understanding. And so for me, I just feel like it's best you're able to then utilize it as a cinematographer and use preconceived ideas in a way to, I think, be playful with that concept. And I guess on Friday, we talked a little bit about, I guess, trying to describe an example of that. I use the idea of like windows being blown out. Like if you go back to like early, you know, mid 20th century films, or whatever, you might sort of see like backdrops exposed at the same value as an interior, and why that looks strange to you. And I think now at this point, for example, I think people are relatively understanding about how like we expect the windows to blow out a little bit or have a little texture, but most of the information is gone, to assume that the image is somewhat truthful. For example, now these are all very broad ideas, of course, and I don't mean to, you know, get too specific, because each film or each cinematographer will have a different perspective about what that appropriateness is. But for me, the reason why I like knowing that and thinking about that as I light a set or do a certain camera move is you can sort of play with that. And I think, you know, the first shot of Moonlight's a great example of that as well. I think the way the camera does that big oneer where we're spinning around the two characters in this almost like music video kind of way, a little bit, is hyper style. Photographing two characters, I think we've a lot of times, if you're watching like American media, generally seen, you know, a couple black guys that are dealing drugs and thinking about them in this sort of hyper sort of like rap video kind of world a little bit, and moving the camera as such. Whereas us sort of playing with those expectations slightly. And then, you know, the next edit, for example, is a handheld shot running through a grassy field with the young little character, and that becomes, you know, so it's almost like we're using the preconception of what people are used to seeing these two characters like, and then switching that and saying no, actually this is the aesthetic of the film, and being and playing with those expectations. Does that make sense at all? I'm sort of rambling a little bit, but
Yeah.
I think you can play with visual expectations now, especially because I think the audience is so savvy. You're able to sort of like use what you think the audience is expecting against them, so to speak, and let them think they know something, ease them into the film, and then shift at some point to take them somewhere different. I think that's very much sort of that's the kind of stuff that I love. I do love letting audiences think they know what we're doing visually speaking, sort of lull them into some sense of expectations, and then being able to play with those expectations visually is something I quite love a lot.
Yeah. Well, that's wonderful. And, I think that's a perfect segue to go into Moonlight and talk about what you guys did there, because there's just so much to talk about. And it's, I'd still, to this day, I'm just blown away at what you and the whole team achieved, because like you said, that was a relatively small project. And at the time, you didn't really necessarily know what it was going to end up being.
No, not at all.
It's to this day a movie that people talk about and reference, and I think will continue to for decades. And it's absolutely beautiful. So is this the first film you shot anamorphic?
First feature-length film, yes. I think I've done some smaller projects, but yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'd like to talk about the format and what you guys were. How did you put that to use? What was the real decision-making process there?
I think for that decision for us was largely about trying to present what was a very subtle and nuanced, story about characters that were, maybe soft-spoken or quiet, or just like the moments that, generally speaking, were not big. They're sort of like the beauty of that film for me are these small decisions that Chiron makes along the way, and and the subtlety that Barry sort of brings to the screen. But we wanted to present those things as big and with as big a punch as we possibly could. So if you're presenting nuance and subtlety, but with a bang and with a big sort of loud voice, was basically the concept. Does that make sense? Which we thought Anamorphic sort of did. We thought we wanted to sort of get really big with small stuff. Because that's sort of, I think, how Chiron was, experiencing his journey there a little bit as well. And I think that's very true how Barry and I think generally we're very character driven. Most decisions we make have to do with character, actually, less than story, which I think is a distinction I find quite interesting personally. This is not Barry, I'm not speaking for Barry, but for myself, I sort of feel like the story's already there. The script exists. No matter what we do, the characters are going to say these lines, do these actions, and we put these things together and the story functions. But as a cinematographer, if you can present character and think about character as you go through your decision-making processes, I think that's more valuable to me, how I see it. And let the story tell itself, because it's inevitable. But the job for me feels like it's a much more character-driven process than anything else, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm being quite broad with some of my statements today.
It's all good.
Hopefully that's logical. Anyway, yeah.
Well, a friend and fellow cinematographer has actually asked the question. This is from Zach Cooperstein.
Hey, Zach.
That you've spoken about it being more like a fever dream. And he was wondering if, you or Barry had a dream that led up to these specific visuals in the film.
That's so funny. I don't think so. I wish I could say that was a cool idea. Man, on a personal level, I don't remember my dreams. I very rarely do. So I can't say that it was a real dream for me. Maybe for Barry. I mean, for Barry, and Terrell, the writers. I mean, it's a personal, very sort of almost biopic journey for those guys. And so, autobiographical. So for them, I'm sure it can feel that way. I'm sure it does. In fact, I feel like a fever dream of sorts. Yeah, I'm sure for them it would. But yeah, the fever dream concept, though, conceptually was this idea of like a heightened reality. I think that's sort of how we talk about it a little bit, in that sense of it. feels real, like reality does, but it takes a beat further, and the colors are more vibrant, and the images are, you know, more than just documentary style. They are, you know, they come with boldness and strength. And, you know, that's at least how I think about my dreams very often. They don't feel like, there's no realness to them. There's always an otherworldliness to them. So I think that that's sort of fair, and why we sometimes talk about film as a fever dream, visually speaking.
And I think that the composition is so, there's like a centered feeling to the composition too, and what you guys have done. It's all right there in front of you.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot to do with perspective and character, going back to that idea. For us, you know, what's really important is in this example of Moonlight, it's all about seeing things from the perspective of Chiron, the main character, and watching him as we you know, document his life. And I think for me, when I think of memories or dreams, or how I would sort of put myself in a person's perspective, it is about that center framing, because I want the audience to like look as if it's a camera perspective attached to almost a face, let's say. So, you know, it doesn't really work as well if it's off-centered or down here or whatever it might be. If you're talking to someone, you're looking at their face. I'm not sure how else to put it. So that's sort of a lot of, I think psychologically anyway, a lot of where that kind of stuff comes from.
And I just have to ask, because I do hear, you know, people speak about the challenges of shooting anamorphic, and whether that's the, you know, the fall off on the tops, bottoms, edges, whatnot, you know, holding focus, close focus, you know, so on and so forth. So I'd be interested to hear, you know, did you run into these situations? How did you work
all the time? Constantly, every day, every single moment. But that's the job. I mean, you know, you learn what lenses have in their character, and you utilize them appropriately. So yeah, you're always dealing with all those things, of course. But you know, especially when you're working with Barry, and the sort of some sort of baseline style that we like to do is use all these different things. That what you're seeing here is actually our lens test for Moonlight. I sent in for you guys to share a little bit. This is kind of fun stuff. This is just very basically cool. Barry and I together. And yeah, feel free to flick through these as we talk. There's Barry,
That's great.
But you can see it there. I mean, you can see all the aberrations on the top and bottom, and obviously Barry's shallow focus, and et cetera, et cetera. But we sort of felt like, I think going back to this idea of truthfulness that we talked about a little earlier, and the audience's understanding of what like a lens flare looks like, and the acceptance of these things, we wanted to use them, because it felt like if we implemented and used these aberrations, these characteristics that feel like flaws, it would feel that much more genuine. Does that make sense as well? Like, it just felt like, you know, seeing these flaws, there's some amount of the flaw, that idea, to me anyway, that makes the image ring more truthful. But it's a playfulness, because it doesn't look like a documentary, of course, that's not the goal either. But if you have, for me, if you're trying to present these things with huge, big, grand voice of a widescreen image and the scope of all those things, you kind of might want to then deteriorate parts of the frames as well, so that the image doesn't fall too far into this hyper real thing either. So you're kind of, I think for me, playing with the balance of, big, strong, loud, cinematographic voices with some things falling off the edges is a balance that I sort of find myself in oftentimes.
I have to ask this, because if I don't, I'll get in trouble with the audience, but just curious if you shot the lenses wide open or if you closed down for more control.
Yeah, it's so funny. The answer is relatively wide open. Sort of I think we did the V lights, and they sort of range between, I think, 2.3 and 2.8, depending on what lens you're on. I could be wrong, but I think that's right. And this year, when Moonlight played a camera homage this year, there was another film that the name is escaping me, also shot in the same lenses, but did deeper stops at like 5.6, I think 4, 5.6, and even 8. And watching the two films, because they both played on the same screen on different days, but I went to go see both, and it was just amazing how different they felt. which was wonderful. And I talked to the guys at Hawk about it that day, and I remember, I think I was really pleased with that it was amazing to sort of see two greatly different looking movies with very different ideas and voices use the same tool, but to very different, in very different ways. So I thought that was quite cool.
Yeah, very nice.
Yeah.
And then just moving on to talk about the color. The color is so strong. And wondering how much of that did you rely on in post? Did you have to do quite a bit of tuning there? Or?
I love the DI. It's like literally, I love it almost as much as being on set. And I've worked for a long time with a colorist named Alex Bickle out of New York, who I think is just, I can't speak more highly of. I just find him to be really, really talented and a great person. He's a friend, and we go back a long ways. And so we worked very, very hard. And I think Barry really loves that DI process as well. So Barry was with us in the DI every day as well as he was on Beale Street. So the DI process for us is actually really, really critical. And we it's not about like fixing things as much as it is like we play with LUTs quite a lot. We're big into that sort of LUT world. And Alex will work with us and help develop one's particular projects. For example, the Beale Street Could Talk one, that was one particularly made for that film entirely. With Moonlight was a little bit different. I think we ended up choosing some after the fact. Being a small film with little prep, we didn't have a lot of luxury to sort of play that in that pool before shooting. But that choosing LUTs, developing LUTs, finding one that works for the project, tweaking things, all in prep is something that's usually a part of the process at this point now. But Miami also too, by the way, a hugely beautiful city with lots of color and lots of contrast and big, grand, huge, beautiful skies. And, that was the baseline. So as much as, people like to talk about, or I like to talk about, how much work we did in the color for the DI, but what was in there was already pretty epic and colorful in the city of Miami, and all the faces involved and all that. So there's a real strong foundation for what ended up being the color process.
Yeah, and I don't know. Yeah. I remember being in a theater watching the film and feeling sweaty through the entire film because of because of just the visuals, what you guys had up there.
Cool.
It's like. Yeah. Living in Florida is a whole nother experience. You went to college there. I lived down there for 3 years, and it's just like, wow,
cool.
It's like,
yeah.
But you could feel it. You guys made that emotional connection without a doubt.
Yeah, that was important. There's no doubt about it. That was a hugely important thing for Barry, was to, and we worked really closely with the makeup artist, Donnie Davey as well, to dial that in and find the right product that gave the right kind of, sheen and a little bit of perspiration feeling to people's faces all throughout. So it was huge. We spent time dialing that in, and that, a lot of credit I think does go to Donnie, who did a fantastic job on the film. And but no, that's just another example of what goes into finding what I don't like talking about like real images, but like truthful images in that sense. And that was something that we definitely worked hard trying to figure out. Yeah.
And then moving on to Beale Street, so you guys jumped from 35 digital anamorphic to 65 digital spherical.
We weren't satisfied with that, the massiveness of Moonlight. We wanted to go bigger. Yeah.
And it's
cool.
Yeah, very cool. And I think love to hear kind of the approach to that, and was it basically that? Was it just, we need to go bigger? Was it that simple?
Going into the prep and development of that show, the 65 had been out for a little while, but not a long time, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe a year or two. I'm sure there were things early on too that maybe I wasn't aware of, but I sort of, in conceiving of the project, felt like when I was hearing about the 65, I thought, oh, that could be really interesting. And the more and more I thought about it, and the more and more times I read the novel, the James Baldwin novel, Beale Street Could Talk, and more, just more work by Mr. Baldwin generally, I just felt like the 65 was just a really wonderful tool to adapt his voice as a writer of the book. I'm not sure if it's true for everyone's feelings, but when I read his books, they're just really this really wonderful balance of strength and subtlety and precision and like boldness is sort of how when I read his novels, these are the sort of sentiments I feel about him. And that's definitely true for If Beale Street Could Talk, for sure, for me anyway. And I thought, okay, well, what's the camera system that sort of feels most akin to that? So for me, that was the 65. I mean, the big strongness of the size of the sensor and the depth of the field and all that goes along with it, but also the details and the nuance of the system as well. So it just felt like it was just, it didn't take long to like convince ourselves that that was the right idea. We did a test, of course, and again, the minute we turned the camera on, it just sort of clicked. It just made sense. We went through some different lens choice options. In the end, went with the DNAs, which were, I just think, are beautiful, and worked really well for this project. So yeah, I mean, it was about that combination of that strength and boldness and power that he writes with, that the book is sort of, you know, depicting, mixed with that sort of, again, that precision and delicacy that he speaks with as well.
It's been really fun working with filmmakers and hearing kind of about their learning experience with the format and putting it into these type of scenarios, which necessarily are not related to the format in the classical sense that we're used to. And Beale Street is a very intimate piece. You know, it's very much, you know, smaller rooms, or, you know, rooms with small amounts of characters, and using the format in there, people discover how they really, really love using it for close-ups, using it for portrait type work. Did you find yourself during the course of this discovering things that you necessarily didn't expect, or, you know, being surprised by something?
Yeah, I did. I think it's fair to say, for me, what came really quickly, and I think for me still rings true today, is what an amazing way it captures performance more than anything else. Like if I was an actor, I would be actually, you know, asking films to shoot on this format, because to me what it does is, you know, it has the same sensibility of a close-up, where you all of a sudden feel like you are in that performance, in that actor and that character's, you know, space in terms of size on the set, like on a, you know, say a 65 mil at a certain distance. But then in addition, all of a sudden we see more. So you're seeing more performance in a more powerful way. In a way that we, you know, we would associate what psychologically we think about and how our eyes and our brains tune into a 65 mil close-up on 35, and all of a sudden we see more physicality. So that was the sort of the to me, the most interesting thing, that it captured performance incredibly well. Not to mention just the detail. I know some people don't love the detail because you see, you know, call them flaws or whatever you want to call them in people's faces and skin and blah, 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 blah. But you know, that's real, and that's truthful as well. So I tend not to be too scared of that. And, you know, you can use filtration and all kinds of different things to smooth things out anyway. So if you can sort of see the subtlety in performance that might be, you know, that might not be as present on a 35 mil size sensor or something like that. You know, all of a sudden you're just seeing that extra bit of fine-tuned performance in a way. So that to me was like, I think, relatively interesting, because you're right. I think traditionally we think of large format as, you know, big, epic, scopy Marvel movie kind of science fiction pieces, or landscapes or whatever it might be. I think the human face and the physicality is captured incredibly well on a large format camera, actually, and the 65, I think, of course, is a good example of that.
How did your production designers and makeup artists and so on and so forth adapt to it?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a good question. I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know that I ever heard anyone feel nervous about it, to be perfectly honest. I think the way I convinced the production designer about it, and I would, you know, just generally production in general about it, was, you know, there was at some point a fear about the physical size of the camera, and all these different actors in these small rooms and furniture and, you know, things like that. I don't know, you know, I think but, you know, like you alluded to earlier, the flip side of that, of course, is you see more dressing, you see more physical space in general. And so, you know, we obviously, all the sets had ceilings, and we were, with the exception of, we were mostly location based, so that wasn't a problem. But Mark Freeberg, who's, I think, just an incredible production designer who worked with us on If Beale Street Could Talk, he just did, I think, an amazing job. And I think he loves building in that sort of, more holistic way, as far as I understand, with working with him at this point now twice. He's happy to make it all feel real and feel right, as opposed to like leaving roofs off sets and things like that, which I generally don't love. We'll cut a hole in that thing if need be, but
Gotcha. So we have some great questions coming in from the audience, and I'd like to talk about that because they are very specific to this film, cool. Especially. Cool. And so, the one is lighting for darker skin tones, and the question about how do you have a specific technique for that or approach?
Yeah, I don't know. It's funny. I went to film school with Barry. We connected really quickly early on. I shot a number of small short films for him in school, and I was learning cinematography at the same time working with him. And when that happens, of course, is you're learning cinematography as you learn to photograph. Period. You're photographing people of color, because even then Barry was, generally speaking, making films in and about people of color, of course. So it was sort of hand in hand for me. I never had to like relearn something or try a different technique. And so it's always hard for me to answer this question, because I don't know. It just, whatever I do generally is, I guess, the answer to the question. So I don't have like a technique that's different. Like, for example, if I'm in a scene with people, like there's a photograph, if Mark can pull it up, if in Beale Street Could Talk, where, I don't know if I sent you both photos, but there's a lawyer scene where the mother and the daughter are talking to a lawyer who's a white guy. I don't remember doing anything different for the white actor to the leads. So I don't know. I think what works for me when I photograph people of color seems to just automatically work for me when I'm photographing people that look more like myself. Yeah, there you go. I mean, I don't know. I don't think I did. I think the key light on him is the same key light that's on them, for example. The same exposure value in general of the fill level is the same as on them. So I don't think I did anything different in this moment at all, for example. I think for me, generally speaking, I do end up using a lot of soft sources overall, which tend to, when you use a soft source in general, whether it's a bounce or whether it's a diffuse source, what you get is that reflective quality on skin tone. Because you're seeing whether it's a big 8x or 12x or even a 4x, softly reflecting in their skin. So that's my default anyway. And I tend to use those kinds of techniques. There you go. That's the other side of the conversation, for example. So anyway,
beautiful. Nice.
I don't tend to do anything different. It's a weird conversation to have, because I honestly, I don't know why. Clearly people struggle with figuring this out. I don't really understand why, to be honest. No,
I think that's a reassurance, and I think, it's great because yes, I remember being back in film school and having that, having our teachers talk about lighting different skin tones and how it was, it seems challenging back then.
It's in books that I read when studying cinematography and lighting. I remember reading about those and I was just like so confused.
But it's wonderful because, we have people chiming in saying the exact same thing, that there is no real special technique. You light them beautiful just as you would light them anyone else. And I
think you get into a danger. You get into a danger when you start to like get your meter out or get your spot meter out, spot reading someone's face and thinking, okay, that skin tone has to be, a stop and a half darker than the gray card. And that's how I measure people of color. I think that's like, okay, well, that's insane, because someone's skin might be a different value, and that's how they look. So that's how I feel about it. I don't necessarily, the goal is not to kind of come to some, mediocre level of what people of color's skin read at on a spot meter. I mean, that just makes no sense to me. However, I remember driving down Sunset one day and seeing a billboard. I can't remember it was a TV series about, it was definitely I can't remember the name of the show. Anyway, but it was about people of color. And I looked up, and literally everyone on the billboard had the exact same skin tone. And it just confused me, because it's like, and it was like, as if they clearly designed this so that everyone had the same value. They'd done a bunch of Photoshop work and blah, blah, blah. And I remember looking at it and just being ultimately incredibly confused that that was the choice that someone made to homogenize all these faces into the same value. So anyway, I don't try and do any of that because it seems a little silly to me.
Yeah. So actually that, you brought up metering, and that's another question that people are asking, do you use a light meter? Do you use a color meter, or do you go off of monitor and waveform and vector scopes?
Yeah. Yeah. So I have a meter. It doesn't come out of my pocket all that much anymore. But I will bring it around because what I find is if I'm moving from set to set, I can bring the meter out and dial in the lighting levels quicker than sometimes the camera department is ready to get the camera set up in the right place. So I use it largely for speed, and then some fine-tuned adjustments once the camera's up and we have a monitor to sort of make some more fine-tuned adjustments from. That's generally speaking my sort of process. So I still do use it, but it's not the last thing I use, for example. So I'll start with that to get a base level of functionality to the set, and then dial in from there. So I guess I use both. Is sort of the thought.
Cool. Good.
Yeah.
Question about diffusion filters. Do you have go-to diffusion filters that you rely on?
Yeah. I stole my diffusion filter idea from Mike Lacus years and years and years ago. Because I was on a set helping him out operating one day, and I realized he was using these smoke filters, SMOQUE, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. I've never even heard of that. And then started using them after ripping him off, and and now I still use them today.
Awesome.
I use them. I didn't use them on Moonlight, but I used them on Beale Street, and I've used them a lot of commercials since then as well. I did use them on the last show, Underground Railroad, as well. I love just how they sort of the bloom, the highlight. I generally speaking, it depends on the show. I don't think I've ever gone past smoke 1. I think most of the time I'm either 1 or half, and then if I have like light sources in the frame, I'll kind of go down to 1/4 and 1/8.
Right.
Generally speaking, but that's a filter I'm using a lot these days and have been for a few years.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the interesting
Sorry,
things.
Mike Galakis.
That's it. He's coming after you.
I'm sure.
Giving away his secrets.
Yeah.
That's one of the things, I guess, again, as an audience member who's very focused on cinematography, when I see some sort of strange pattern, in the highlights or in the light sources, it kind of bugs me a little bit. And so I was always curious what is it you look for? How can you use diffusion filter without impacting those type of scenarios?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Because I sort of like all that weird stuff. That's sort of half the joy for me is finding filters that do, leave artifacts and weird stuff in there. So, like for example, the smokes, they have a rainbow color to them. If you see the sun in your frame a certain way, it'll put a spectrum in a flare, which I quite like, for example. So I think that's interesting, but clearly, not every DP loves that stuff, and lots of them want to work away from flare. But so it's just teach their own, for me, I like that.
No, that's cool. That's exactly what I wanted to kind of hear was, what are those little things that particular filter
it does? So for me, it does a few things. It lifts the blacks. I think I find it rolls the highlight in a nice way, and it oftentimes brings color to flare, like a spectrum of color to flare. Because generally speaking, we talked about this a little bit on Friday. I like to try and lose as much latitude as I possibly can in cameras. I try to I know you guys put a lot of work into making these cameras have the biggest latitude possible. But what I end up doing is trying to break that up all the time and losing latitude. So if I can lift shadow, pull the highlight down to a curve that feels nice, and in the DI or even with my DIT, then massage those shadows back down to a certain floor, and bring the highlight to a certain place, I can lose a couple stops of latitudes oftentimes. which for me, I really love, because I feel like sometimes there's just too much and the image starts to take on these, like, I just think like false exposure levels. False meaning like, you know, looks not how I digest exposure ranges. So for me, I try to like lose a bit because to me, it doesn't feel real anymore.
So what's that sweet spot for you? You know, if you had to say, this is the day and this is the latitude I want.
Well, I'll also just clarify a little bit, because I think I'm not necessarily asking you guys at ARRI to use latitude, because it does help me a lot for when I make mistakes. You know, so like, I'm not saying lose a bit, but for me, I think 12 stops is plenty. I think 12 stop latitude for me is like a nice level of latitude. You know, 10 to 11, 12, somewhere in there. I've yet to find a project where I was trying to utilize like 14 or 15 stops. It looked so strange to me. So I started dumbing the cameras down a little bit.
Yeah. So moving on to your next project, because I want to kind of segue into this, and I want to talk about HDR.
Yeah.
And because here's a, you know, it kind of feeds into the whole latitude.
No, it's fascinating. I mean, like, we're mastering the show in HDR, so that's going to be really exciting. It's my first time doing this. You know, we didn't really monitor HDR all that much on set, to be perfectly honest. You know, the show just had a schedule that was wildly crazy. So, you know, fine tuning the kind of HDR adjustments for us on set was just like a little bit crazy. We're just moving too fast to find that level of nuance, honestly. But we will be doing the DI and we will be mastering in HDR, which I think will be fascinating.
So do you think you're going to take the same approach and kind of bring things in a little bit?
I'm sure I will. I mean, don't tell anyone else. But I'm sure. Well, you know, I think we'll find that balance. I mean, I think that'll be really interesting. To be for the first time going down this road, I don't really know what to expect from it besides before I get really deep into it. But yeah, there'll be some expansion. I think I'm going to wait to sort of judge until I start watching the movie down that way over and over again to sort of see what it does to me from an audience perspective. Seeing a bit more in the highlight and things like that. But I think HDR, it's less than, to me, it's less about exposure and more about how brightness feels and how much color. See, what I'm excited about in the HDR process is how much color is in the highlight, or how much color is in the shadow. And playing with that seems really exciting to me. I don't necessarily need to utilize all that HDR information to like bring the exposure of that highlight to a certain place. But what is interesting to me about is what color I can find in those highlights and those shadows.
Nice. Very nice. So
I mean, it's my very rudimentary understanding of what HDR is. I've yet to even dig deep into it, but anyway.
No, it's great. I mean, I think everybody's kind of got their own approach to it. And I love the fact that you've highlighted color and getting more color information out of it, as opposed to just saying, I want more detail in the highlights or I want more detail in the shadows. Well, okay, but you're focused on the color, and I agree with you. I think that's one of the most amazing things that HDR can bring is more, I don't want to use the word vibrant, but definitely some more color range, and I guess variation in color. So, I mean,
one of lots of people's favorite, one of my favorite photographers is William Eggleston, and his prints just feel like, they almost just feel like HDR to me. There's just a lovely vibrance of color in those skies and in those shadows and things like that. And so I think if we find a way to use HDR in that realm, I'll be really pleased about it.
Oh, now you got to find some of these images and share with us, because I'm curious about this. But we'll have to add those in later to our.
Sure. Sure. Yeah, I mean the classic famous ones, the little tricycle in the street and things like that. But anyway, cool. we can look some up.
So this next project is called Underground Railroad, and it sounds like quite an ambitious project, because the way I interpreted it was it's almost like a little bit of a history and also an alternative sci-fi aspect to it in a way, right? So
yeah, I mean it's a pretty famous novel that maybe some people have read that are maybe listening. It's a beautiful book, so if anyone in this quarantine moment looking for a book to read, it's one to recommend. But yeah, what you're getting at is generally right. I mean, we're trying not to describe it as like science fiction, because I think that sort of bends the conversation to things that are not
Not real, right?
real or truthful, because the show and the book, discusses, our history as Americans.
Yeah.
It discusses, different. It does. You're right. Plays with time a little bit from the story perspective. It references all kinds of different moments in our history all the way up to now. We were, which was, you're right. But yes, it does sort of bring about this ambitious aspect of the project, because it was, for sure, from my perspective, working with Barry, the biggest scoped story we've ever come close to trying to do. So very excited to sort of share that with people at this point. I'm very proud of it. They're still cutting right now, so nothing to show, but very excited to let the world see what we've been up to the last few years.
Nice. And what I think is interesting and kind of relevant to our conversation, going back to format again, you guys have gone on this project, you went to full frame, but you mixed anamorphic and spherical.
That's right. Exactly.
And curious to hear why you made those choices and what you pulled from each one to benefit the project.
I think we still wanted to work in the large format world. We really enjoyed that coming out of If Beale Street Could Talk, but very quickly realized like going 65 was going to be just too hard. We needed a physical camera that was going to be light, small enough to do handheld with on a regular basis, and mobile enough and be able to fit into small spaces and things like that, which was going to be hard with the 65. So we thought, okay, cool. Well, we have the LF is out now. The LF Mini is out. We can start to think about that as our format and then go from there. We wanted to use both anamorphic and spherical for a few reasons. Mostly had to do with like visual grammar about what stories belong to what sort of time, not to get too far into what the story's about and things like that, because probably should leave that alone a little bit. But we used some lens formats for certain episodes and some for others. And it had to do with, what we wanted to do for each character and things like that.
Cool. And it's without diving into too many details.
That's right.
Was there a lot of testing involved in picking out those lenses and finding?
Yeah, absolutely. Multiple rounds of it, and we were in Atlanta, working on lenses in Los Angeles. So it was a lot of back and forth in email and sending links and things like that. But yeah, we got really dialed in and created some really wonderful lenses that I'm very happy with. And that process was hugely into the prep and test and throw out ideas and see where they go. So yeah, it was on this project particularly, especially because we actually ended up pushing a month in the end anyway. So the prep was very, very long and allowed a lot of conversations to develop and multiple rounds of fine tuning the lenses to a place that we felt really happy with.
Yeah, I was curious because obviously when you get to that kind of place, making sure that all that combination kind of matches and you're not running into any, did you have any issues with that, or was it pretty?
No, I don't, not at all. You mean like whether a certain lens has a warmer feeling or a cooler feeling and things like that? Yeah.
Right, exactly. Yep.
Good question. I'm sure, yes. The answer, yes, technically speaking, is yes, but not to a degree that was problematic. Like, for example, our A set of lenses and our B set of lenses per camera definitely had a huge shift in them. But because we found that out before even day one, we were able to work with the DIT and know, okay, for every B lens, we do this correction, we add this correction to the set and things like that. So, yes, but it by no means was challenging in a way that made things, I didn't think about it at all, to be honest.
Nice.
The DIT can do it. It's not a big deal. I've seen it side by side. They look great with the correction. Moving on. Yeah.
Very cool. So, I can't believe an hour's already flown by. This has been a lot of fun and great. But I'd like to ask one last question because
please, got
to throw a curveball at you.
Please.
If I could give you a little magic lamp and you had a wish.
Yes.
For, something new, something cool that you don't have, you've been wanting, that's missing from your kit. or whatnot on set, what would it be? Just off the top
Like, you mean gear wise?
Yeah, let's say gear wise. We'll limit it down to that.
I have no idea. I have no clue. I love I have no idea, honestly. I don't know. I feel really lucky to work at the moment where all these things are out. I mean, I think it's one of the most wonderful times to be a cinematographer right now, because there's so many great things out there. So yeah, I don't necessarily feel like I'm missing a tool in my toolkit. In a way, I think the more like lightweight and all this stuff gets, I think is fantastic. But that's already happening. I mean, that's already there. I think so. I honestly, no complaints on my end as what you guys have done for us at this point. So sorry to give you no ideas. I am curious. I'm trying to. You know what? Let's not talk about that. That's boring. No, I have nothing to say. Nothing to say. None at all.
We'll go into the overtime with some other stuff then.
That's fine. Please. Yeah, I wish I had an answer. I don't have like a thing I feel like I'm missing. I have no idea what that even be. What other people think they want?
I mean, I've heard all sorts of various things. I've heard things from a better monitoring system to a better wireless video transmitter to a better viewfinder.
Nice. Yeah. Video signals are always a nightmare. I mean, something that would actually work would be nice. Yeah. Things. All the video signals always have problems. I wish that someone. You know what? I wish that someone was talking to me the other day about the idea of a position on the set that was, dedicated to sorting out all the wireless signals, like someone who would manage that. Because I don't know how that stuff works. I think it'd be lovely if someone would help us on the set manage, because we have all these wireless focus, obviously wireless video, wireless sound, walkies, headsets. I mean, it's getting crowded out there on the wavelength world. I think that we're at the point now where you might consider a full-time person managing that would be nice.
I think that is going to happen now in our
wow.
post-COVID situation.
Yeah, I've been hearing a little bit about that, because obviously so much of it now even has to be wireless, whether it's wireless lighting, etc. Well, that's cool.
There we go. Well, that was great. Thank you, James. It was great to spend time with you and talk to you and see you. And
it's great to see you. I look forward to seeing you in person. I'm just here alone in Los Angeles. It's a bit boring. So looking forward to seeing everybody at one point in real life, in the flesh.
Yeah, one way or another, we'll meet up for a drink soon.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
All right, guys.
And thank you everybody that joined us today. Our episodes will be available on our website, ARRIRental.com / or you can go to our YouTube site as well. And join us for our next episode with Florian Ballhaus. We're going to talk about the one and only Ivan, which is a mix of live and virtual capture. So that's going to be a fun conversation. Okay, awesome. Everybody, until the next time, cheers.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.
Take care.